Let me begin the evening by congratulating you, Navtej, on a brilliant book. I must say, I really enjoyed reading it, and for all of you who are present, this is really recommended reading. It is meticulously researched, so well written, and really brings alive, the ferment in Punjab in the early 20th century. So, and of course, it's really topical and relevant today as we celebrate the 75th anniversary of our independence, because, the Jallianwala Bagh massacre was, I guess, a milestone event in our struggle for independence. And so let's begin with that, actually, because, you mentioned this book written by Alfred Draper, which is called Amritsar, the Massacre That Ended the Raj. So, do you agree with that assessment? I mean, where would you place the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, in that whole march towards independence?
Thank you, Arti, and thank you all for deserting the bar and the happier parts of the club for this discussion. I'm not a great fan of Alfred Draper and similar books that were written about Jallianwala Bagh. Let me be honest. There were some books written immediately after Dyer died or during his life, more or less after he died. And they were written entirely from the British point of view. They were written as a kind of defense of Dyer. I presume all of you know the history of the incident. I'm not going to belabor that. And a lot of it was to say that, the British Empire was basically good. This guy was basically good. Something happened to him, So he decided to kill about 700-800 people. Can take it or leave it. But I think I agree with that title of the book, The Massacre That Ended the Raj. Because in many ways, when you look back with the advantage we have of 100 years, that was the inflection point in the freedom movement. It's where things, you changed gears, so to speak. What happened? Till then, Congress was dominated by the moderates, as they used to be called. Moderates were Gokhale, and Gandhi was a newcomer to India. You had the extremists, which were really considered the fringe.
And Gandhi didn't approve of their method.
And Gandhi, of course, was yet to gather his clout that he later had, but he certainly didn't approve of them. But what happened with Jallianwala Bagh in the long context of the freedom movement was that it changed the attitude of the people. First thing it did was that people realized that you can't negotiate with this colonial power. You cannot appease them. You cannot say that we sent 1.5 million people to the war, so we should get dominion status. It's not going to happen. The second thing that happened was that it turned the freedom movement into a national-scale movement. The third thing that happened is it brought Punjab as center stage. So far, Punjab had been iffy, in the sense that it was not the center stage of the freedom movement. There was Bengal, and there was Maharashtra, and there was Tilak, and there was all that. But it brought Punjab center stage. So there were some of these things that happened, and most important, figures like Tagore Tagore renounced his knighthood after Jallianwala Bagh. It's a big blow to the British Empire. Gandhi, who till then was wanting to work with the British establishment. In fact, he was recruiting people for the First World War. He told the Viceroy, I can be your recruiter in chief. I can rain men on you. And he did. He used to actually go on recruiting trips. But then after that, he became a non-cooperator. He said, no, this is not going to work. He changed. He returned his medals. He returned his Kaisar-e-Hind medals and his Zulu War medals, which he had got earlier. So, to answer your question, Arati, I think overall, if you look at the arc of the freedom movement, I think if you look at a point where things really changed, it was Jallianwala Bagh.
So it's interesting that you mention that the massacre brought Punjab center stage. Because if we go back a few, some decades earlier to what was called, you can call it the Sepoy Mutiny, or you can call it the First War of Independence, 1857, that's right. So, in fact, the British Army used 6 soldiers to put down that mutiny. And yet, sort of 5-6 decades later, they just turned on the 6 at Jallianwala Bagh and, sort of killed them off, just like that. So, don't you think it's quite ironic? What is it that changed in those 5-6 decades?
Couple of things, Aarti, I must clarify. One, it's a broadly held convention or conviction that the Sikhs were with the British in 1857. And that presumes one thing, that there were Indians and then there were British. If you look at subaltern histories of the mutiny, if you look at different things, and things will emerge. They have not yet emerged, but things will come out. There will be more writing in the years to come. The Sikhs couldn't be bothered about the British. Who were the people who were mutinying? It was what they used to call the Purbiyas. It was the guys from Meerut and Lucknow and Allahabad, etc. And these were the guys who had fought on the side of the British in the Anglo-Sikh wars.
Yes, absolutely. I'm really glad you brought out this point. This is what I
So
wanted you to
they had
bring out.
fought. When the Anglo-Sikh wars were taking place, who were the guys on the other side? Yes, there were some white soldiers, but there were a lot of Purbiyas, as quote-unquote. So when the mutiny happened, the Sikhs were saying, yeah, let's hammer the Purbiyas, we've got a chance. They were not hammering the Brits. Or they were not greatly in favor of the Brits. So that was one thing I wanted to clarify. Second thing I wanted to clarify, and this, ideally as a Sikh, I should be saying the reverse, but I'm going to tell you the truth. The Jallianwala Bagh is not a Sikh thing. We have projected it, we have believed it, and it's good. But actually, there were a larger number of Hindus and Sikhs and Muslims among the victims. So it was a Punjab thing, And I think that's a very important point to remember, to own, to accept, that a lot of Muslims, a lot of Hindus, and a fair number of Sikhs died in Jallianwala Bagh or were victims. The second thing, and I'm tired of pointing this out in various interviews, that the murals or the things that we have created there today show this joyous women and children jumping around on Baisakhi and going in and getting shot. There were hardly any women,
In fact, that That's my next
Yeah,
point,
so
actually.
I'll wait for that.
Yeah. Because, what I found about your book was the sort of lack of women characters, really. And except for this one, and we will come to her later. But so why? I mean, weren't women, there was so much ferment in Punjab at that time, so much political activity, and so on. So, were women not involved in this? Was it totally sort of kind of male dominated?
You said there are no women characters in the book. There is one amongst nine.
And we will come to
and
her.
there is
because,
one amongst
but
nine.
one
And
amongst
having
nine.
been married to one Punjabi woman for 38 years, I can tell you one is enough. But
Hey, I'm a Punjabi and I object to that.
yeah, so yeah, what was the question?
That why weren't women
No,
more women
because-
involved
I'll
in,
tell you
in
what.
politics in Punjab at that
no,
point?
they were not. They were not. This was partly, Jallianwala Bagh was partly a political gathering. I say partly advisedly, because people think, or the British writers like Draper and various people would better describe it, that there was a riot going on, so he shot. Or there was this violent crowd that he shot. No. It was partly a political crowd. It was Baisakhi. It was the open space in the middle of Amritsar. There was the Rowlatt Act agitation, and we can talk about that if the audience wants to. But there was a Rowlatt Act agitation. And there was a series of hartals and meetings following Gandhi's call for satyagraha. So this was one such political meeting, that we are going to have a meeting in Jallianwala Bagh and continue our protest against the Rowlatt Act, which was a very oppressive act on freedom of speech, freedom of movement, no recourse to judicial process, etc. But there were a lot of people there who were not involved in the politics. They were just resting there. It was Baisakhi. Amritsar used to have the biggest cattle fair in Punjab, where people would come from different places to sell their horses, cattle, buy cattle, whatever. And that day, because of the disturbances that had been going on in the few days preceding that incident, the fair was shut down at 2 o'clock, much earlier than usual. So a lot of people just drifted into the crowd. And there were a lot of kids, because, tamasha, kids going with their dads, grandfathers, hanging around. That's what the crowd was. And women did not go out at that stage in Punjab to political meetings. Yes, you had the women in the freedom movement, but not quite yet. 10 years later, you'll find a lot more women in the forefront. But that time, there weren't.
So let's come to that one woman character you have, because it's, I think her story is a very powerful and moving one. Her ordeal, she went to Jallianwala Bagh to look for her husband and found I think he was dead already by the time she found him. And she couldn't get out. And her ordeal, as she sat there through the night, cradling her husband's head in her arms, and, watching people around her, either dead or dying, that little boy who wanted water and wanted her to, sort of hold his hand as he died. It's an absolutely, it is such a moving and powerful chapter. So maybe you can, and I believe this lady, this character is based on a real life person, actually. Somebody who gave testimony to the Congress Inquiry Committee that was set up, following the massacre. So maybe you'd like to read that, some parts of that chapter, because...
yeah, it's a short chapter.
Yeah.
I could just run through it. But I should tell you about the character before. The character in the book is called Maya Dei. Dei is like a short for Devi. the seed of the character was born from a testimony given to the Congress Inquiry Committee in 1919. Congress Inquiry Committee was held because, to explain the context, the British held a Hunter Committee inquiry after the Jallianwala Bagh. And since they were so biased in setting it up, its parameters, the people it would talk to, etc., Gandhi and others thought that we would have our own inquiry. So Motilal Nehru was the chairman, Gandhi was there, C.R. Das was there, various. And a lot of victims or people, eyewitnesses, etc., came and gave testimony. Now, I've counted the Amritsar testimonies, there are 152. Out of 152, 15 are women. Out of the 15, only one is directly related to the massacre. The others talk of events that happened before or the excesses that happened later because the martial law continued for 6 months. Incidentally, there was no martial law in operation on 13th April 1919. It came into effect only on 15th of April. So Maya Dei is the only person who gives this testimony. It's 1 page and about 3 lines. That's about all. So I took that testimony, and then Maya Dei becomes one of the 9 Ratan Devi was the original. My lady here is Maya Dei, and she sort of, her life, the rest of it is fiction, which and in great detail goes through the arc of her life, but the crux of it is her presence that night in Jallianwala Bagh, which is fictionalized, but it's essentially based on that. So I'm happy to read that. Do you need this? Oh, yeah, I suppose for the recording, otherwise. The darkness thickened around Maya Dei. She could see 2 or 3 lonely lanterns swaying some distance away. Once in a while, a lantern would stop, stoop low, and then, already dimming with disappointment, move on. What were the lanterns seeking, she wondered. Everybody was the same in death. One body the same as another, equally bereft of breath and life. Then she corrected herself as she looked down at her husband. Even in death, one needed to belong. Sorry. Each person was looking for the one they had been born to, or given birth to, or shared a bed with, or perhaps just a meal. She heard a familiar voice and looked around. It was the younger son of Lala Sundardas. The boy, in that numb moment she could not recall his name, had come looking for her. She had rushed out of the house without telling anyone when she had heard the firing in the Bagh. BBG, the boy said, and then stopped, his eyes fixed on Joga Singh's face, calm in death. His mouth fell open, and he could not say anything to her. She spoke, finally. Help me, Kaka. Call your brother. Let us take him away from here. Yes, BBG, the boy said, and rushed away, glad to be given something to do that would get him away from there. For an hour, Maya Dei waited, her eyes fixed at the point at which the boy had vanished into the darkness. A man carrying the dead body of a young boy over his shoulder was walking away, not too far from her. He seemed taken aback to see a woman sitting in the garden of desolation, among the dead and the dying. Then he seemed to understand that she was waiting for help. Bibi, it is difficult for people to come. It's past 8 o'clock and there is curfew. They are afraid of being shot. Everybody, even this, my only boy, has been shot. And the man trudged away under his heavy burden, each step taking him further into unending grief. The clock from the tower began to strike. She was not sure what hour it struck, perhaps 9 or 10, but she knew it was late. If no one was going to come to help her, then she must go herself and find help. She would go to Sundardas's house and get the boys herself. But they must be afraid of the curfew, otherwise they would have returned by now. But surely there must be people who would listen to her pleas. Perhaps some of the students she had seen in the evenings who studied and slept at the Dharamsala attached to the temple complex in Ablova Katra. She picked her way through the piles of bodies, careful not to step on anyone or hurt anyone who might be wounded or step into someone's blood. But without a lantern, it was impossible to be too careful. She found herself asking forgiveness from everybody and everything, and only one word kept quivering on her lips: Waheguru, Waheguru. He alone would guide her through the darkness, through that night.
No, I think hopefully that should entice people to buy the book and read it. It's a very moving chapter, very, very moving chapter. How much time do we have? Okay, no, one last question I want to ask him because, so we'll skip the other thing, but I think we should talk about Udham Singh, who was a really major character in the Jallianwala Bagh massacre whole drama. And so we had this film called Sardar Udham, and we have your book in which Udham Singh is a major, one of the 9 protagonists and a major one. And the way the film handled the character and the way you have handled the character are quite different. In fact, just the location. The film puts him right there, at the scene of the massacre, whereas you place him in East Africa. So, considering that I think historical novels, historical films are increasingly important today, particularly for a younger generation, to help them access our history and understand it. When discrepancies like this happen, it's kind of, disturbing. So, and I did read your column on Udham Singh, in which you've really torn the film apart because, on the film, because, you've pointed out the various inaccuracies. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, this is, again, it's up to each creative person, whether a writer or a movie maker, to decide what he wants to do with history. And for better or for worse, I prefer to be old-fashioned. I think we have no right to change history. We have no right to distort history. We interpret history, yes, and we are not new. History is interpretation, and as I say in the prologue, you will, depending on where you stand, you're brown or you're white, you're colonizer or the colonized, you're a historian or you're a novelist, you will interpret history. The film, I've watched it several times. I fast-forwarded it several times. They do run disclaimers. But the disclaimers are in such tiny fonts and they vanish so quickly that nobody ever reads them. They don't expect you to read disclaimers. These are just defenses. But the fact is, when you're dealing with history, this may be the only book that somebody reads on Jallianwala Bagh and goes away with thinking that this is the truth. That movie may be the only thing you ever see about Udham Singh. There's so much else coming, you don't want to see 10 movies on Udham Singh. And you might get the impression, he was there, he was carting dead bodies on this hand cart and he was... No, he wasn't. He wasn't. No serious historian has proven that Udham Singh was there. Yes, there are legends that he was there. He gave water. So I had this great choice. And my view has always been that you take history, you take it as it is, you fill in the gaps with fiction. You fill in the inner lives with fiction. You don't change those facts. So I relied on the fact that Udham Singh, I read his transcripts of his trial, and in the trial he says very clearly that they ask him, did you know that Michael O'Dwyer, whom he shot, as you all know the story, did you know he was governor of Punjab? He says, I don't know. I wasn't there. I was in East Africa. He says it in black and white. And when a man is going to hang in a few days, he can see that he's going to get the death penalty. Why will he lie? He could have said, yes, I killed him because I was there and I saw so and so many people being shot. He doesn't say that. So I chose that route. The filmmakers chose a different route, but that's up to them. But, you know, so actually I have tried to justify it because in a passage, we may not have time to read it, but he actually says that I have thought of that incident so much that it has stopped mattering whether I was there or I imagined I was there. Whether my brother died or everybody, the people who died were my brothers. So, you know, you take it into the zone of the indeterminate.
Yeah.
In fiction, you can do that.
Yeah.
In a movie, I suppose you have to be more decisive.
Well, I guess, you know, in the movie he appears more of a hero because, you know...
Well, actually, he's a better hero when he was not there. Because I feel that, you know, he held that thing in his heart for 20 years.
Yeah, absolutely.
And he had no personal loss. He was an orphan. His brother had died years before Jallianwala Bagh. So even if for a moment we presume he was there was nobody of his own who died. But he wasn't there, which makes it even more dramatic. He was bothered by the fact that this had happened. And for 20 years, he's an amazing character.
Yeah, quite
He's an amazing character. He dodges the best intelligence services of the world. He has multiple identities. In those days, he has different passports. He has 6 different names. He can move people across borders. He can move himself up and down. People are looking for him. They can't catch him. And he does what he has to. And he's prepared for what happens to him.
So, now we can have questions from the audience. I mean, I hope, you know, I hope this conversation has interested you enough to, you know, sort of read the book and, you know, really go into, you know, Punjab at that time and the events leading to Jallianwala Bagh, the massacre at Jallianwala Bagh, and of course, subsequently, you know, what followed and then subsequently our independence. So, any questions?
Hi. Good evening. First of all, thank you so much. It was very, very insightful listening to both of you talk about this book and discuss it. I'm definitely going to be taking a copy for myself. At the cost of slightly being tangential, I wanted to ask you, because I don't feel like I'm old enough to have a take on this debate. As a former diplomat, as well as a historian with a specialization in this particular field or topic, where do you stand on the debate of reparations owed to colonies for the atrocities by the East India Company as a whole?
Yes, this is a very woke question. And, you know, there are 2 ways of looking at it, honestly. One is that we keep on hoping for reparations, we keep on hoping for apologies, we keep on hoping for people to come on bended knee and send things back to us. It's a good thought. It's not going to happen. On the other hand, we can't stop asking for it, right? I myself wrote an article 3 years ago when I said deep regret is not enough. Deep regret was the word used by Theresa May on the centenary of Jallianwala Bagh. So I said, no, you have to say more. But they're not willing, because once they say apology, they admit a wrong which becomes culpable. At the moment, they have passed it off as an aberration. You know, everybody says that Winston Churchill was critical of Dyer. If you read Winston Churchill's speech in 1919, it's a very clever speech. Yes, he was critical of Dyer because he said, yeah, let Dyer roast. Let's save the British Empire. So he said, yeah, he is the worst guy, terrible guy, but he is not the British Empire. So similarly, I think we have more success in terms of return of physical items. Let's not go to the Kohinoor, that's too complicated. But you know, there are others, and it's happening, and France is taking a lead role in that. Maybe Belgium will, maybe England will, but you know, Cameron said a few years ago that if we start returning everything, there'll be nothing left in the British Museum, yeah, which is true. But that is the way of the colonial world. That is the. So I say that we should approach this thing realistically. There are some things you can get. You get the odd statue back. More than that, and maybe it's good to not get some things back. I know I'm going to be on record on this, but in the sense that you retain your memory of loss. You know, you retain the fact that yes, you had a certain situation which you lost for various reasons. Let's not ever repeat that. So this is going to be an ongoing debate. I think you'll have limited successes. You'll have some statues removed. You'll have some things returned. But nobody is ever... Because let's also face it. Those people say, look, it wasn't us today. Today, if you find somebody who defends Dyer today, yes, go for him.
I also feel that, to keep seeking reparation for historical wrongs, just keeps that canker in your soul, and it prevents you from moving on. Ultimately, things do happen in history. Some are really terrible and, they hit you badly. But, you do have to move on because, you do have to live and you do have to progress and you do have to develop. So, I don't think we can go on and on about it,
But there is a parallel thing in this. And there is that, yes, while it could be very good for the British Queen or to come to Jallianwala Bagh and say, I'm really sorry this happened. There's another way of looking at it, is retain the tragedy for the future generations, all of you. I always give this example of Auschwitz. Auschwitz in Poland.
Yeah.
Auschwitz and Birkenau, where millions of Jews were gassed. I have spent many, many hours in Auschwitz, over 4 years. And I can tell you that you go there, you don't need another reminder. You feel it. You feel it. You feel so many people dead. You feel the loss. So what we're doing, unfortunately, we don't keep our memorials the same way.
Navtej, I went to Jallianwala Bagh
And?
before the new thing has been done. This is some years ago. And you go there, it was unkempt. There were empty potato chip bags lying around. Kids playing cricket. And, and there were the bullet holes on the wall, the well into which people jumped and, died. But nobody seemed to care. They
And
were all
now-
having a picnic there.
Now it's become a selfie spot. I went 3 years ago before the present renovation or whatever it is, beautification. There were people with big kids climbing up the memorial to get pictures. I saw it. It made my blood boil.
Yeah.
And
So-
there was a big board saying no shoes allowed beyond this point. So I would rather say, keep that memorial. Keep that memorial in such a place that when every Britisher comes, his head bows involuntarily. You don't have to force him. But keep it, evoke that feeling, Today what has happened, they've got soldiers which made out of leaves and like bushes shaped like soldiers. It's a joke. It's a joke.
Yeah.
I've got a question. I'm sure you've done many
Sorry.
Recording.
Navtej, I'm sure you've done a lot of talks and faced a lot of questions. Have you found your audiences having the ability to accept the real facts of history and history being stated for what it was than the narrative that it's been put into?
No. The point is that I have found that if you give it straight from the shoulder, as on a point of view, you find a lot of people accepting it. And that's my sense of, that gives me a sense of hope. I have maybe done 10, 15, after the book has come out, sessions like this, but I must say that nobody seriously contradicted me on any of these points, because I think you have to back it with things. You have to have the conviction that this is, I'm saying this because of this, and you come up and counter me if you have a strong enough counter reason. So I think ultimately, as I say, history doesn't change. It's the interpretation which changes. History can't change. History is a fact, And then when you write a book and then you say, no, this is a socialist view of history, this is a leftist view of history, this is a rightist view of history, this is a revisionist view of history. These are interpretations. So ultimately, I think people who are really interested in history have to get down to the facts and make their judgments based on facts.
Hi, good evening, ma'am. Good evening, sir. Thank you for coming over. I have a question. You were reading a chapter from your book, and it was aftermath of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, and it's through the eyes of one of the woman characters. It was too difficult to even listen to that, it's heavy writing. What are your thoughts when you write something like this? How do you imagine it? How do you live with this? How do you write it?
You have to live it. If you want to make the reader feel it, then you have to feel it as a writer, which is why it takes so much time. It takes so much emotional involvement in a character. Somebody asked me a few days ago that these 9 characters, how do you know them so well or whatever? I don't know if I've succeeded, but after you read the book, you will think. When I gave this example, I said the day when, I revised and I revised and I revised, and when the second draft, the third draft, the fourth draft, the publisher's drafts, and before that there were dozens more. But when I thought I had done my final changes, and send them off to David Devidar. I was knocking around the house all day, not knowing what to do. And ultimately, I realized what was happening. And I said to my family, I said, I'm feeling like this because all those people I've sort of been living with have gone. That day you really feel, what am I going to do with the rest of my life?
Sir, I have not read the book yet, and I'm going to definitely pick it up and I'm going to read it. I have a question. I don't know if there's a character in there or not, but did you imagine the story from one of the person who's actually shooting, I did read it somewhere that those people were from Afghanistan or something like that. So what's their viewpoint when they're shooting people of the same skin color?
Very good question. And I'll answer it in two parts. One, there is one character, protagonist, not character, I would say, because there are 9 protagonists in the book. One of the protagonists is the guy, the British guy, standing behind Dyer. He was the ADC to Dyer. And he exists. He existed. Except that we don't know what, he only left one paragraph. And I have created an entire life of that ADC. That ADC, what he sees, what he feels for years later, is given in the book. I thought it would be a great thing if I could write from one of the soldiers' points of view.
Yes.
I'm telling you that. Mm-hmm. I thought of that. But it didn't work. Who were the soldiers who fired? There were Gurkhas.
Yes.
And there were Baluchis.
Baluchis, yeah, correct.
Dyer specifically chose this because they were not, it was a haphazard collection of soldiers in Amritsar at that moment. The Gurkhas were detrained. They were on their way from somewhere to somewhere. They were taken off their train, they were issued rifles and they said, chalo. 25 Gurkhas and 30 Gurkhas only with kukris. And 25 Baluchis with guns. And Dyer chose these people because he said they have no sympathy with the Punjabis. And they didn't. So they shot. Later on, there is one piece of paper somewhere, one archival evidence that some of those Gurkhas gave statements years later. That bahut maza aaya, bahut mara kind of thing. So, I didn't want, it didn't work for me. As a terrible narrator to have a Gurkha saying, bahut maza aaya mara. The other guy I thought of, I think I'll take second. But I didn't use him ultimately. There was one of the British officers called Massey. He was a major. And he was important in Amritsar. He brought a lot of troops, Major Massey. Massey was so disgusted, he never went back. He converted to Islam and stayed on in India. So, they were you could come at it from different ways, but ultimately I had to, make my selection.
No, but I think what Navtej is saying just proves how cleverly the British exploited the divisions, in this whole sort of subcontinent. I mean, we may all be the same skin color, but we have different histories, we have different cultures, we have different religions, and the British exploited them. I mean, as you pointed out, the whole sort of Sepoy mutiny, the Sikhs were fighting the Purabias, because the Purabias had fought with the British to destroy Ranjit Singh's empire. So, there are all these divisions which the British exploited, and that's how they ruled so, sort of cleverly
That's why they were so bothered with Hindu-Muslim unity in those days.
Yeah.
As this book will show you.
In fact, that's, I think, a real, irony again.
and the
because
identities.
at that time, the whole sort of unity between Hindus, Muslims and Sikhs, and yet Punjab paid a huge price during partition.
Absolutely, and that time, the identities, we don't have enough time to go into that, but the identities, the Hindu-Sikh identity was a very composite identity. And, there was this whole tradition in the 19th century of where the identities were very mixed. I mean, and there's several characters here you will find who, the same year you could go to the Khanka of Sakhi Sarwar Pir in the Suleiman Mountains, and you could go to the Golden Temple, and the same person could, go to Sitala Devi to pray that they are cured of smallpox. So, this was the composite Punjab identity. And later on, the various reasons, there was the Christian missionary takeover of Punjab, there was the Arya Samaj in a very aggressive mode, and then the reaction of the Singh Sabha from the Sikhs. When all your identities became more concretized and
separate.
And even in 1919, you have the Ram Navami just before Jallianwala Bagh was a great display of Hindu-Muslim unity in Amritsar. They were all walking together, they were drinking water from the same cup, and this was what was bothering the Brits. And then, of course, from then to partition, you all know what happened, and it's another story.
So I have a last question, if you allow me. What I have always perceived of partition or Jallianwala Bagh from my forefathers is a pain. So whatever they have discussed with me, or as a kid I have heard about the stories, has always been the pain they have or the suffering they have. So you have told that history should be untampered, or history should be the interpretation. These days, there's so much of political vendetta, turmoil happening. How, as a generation coming up, whom to believe or whom not to believe as a history which has been carried forward? So I don't know. I just got to know that the regiment has the Gorkhas and Baluchis. This was I never encountered this as a fact. So when we see the facts or we listen to the facts, whom to believe or whom not to believe? Because
believe what you read.
You have to go deeper than Instagram.
Yes. When I say
And WhatsApp.
When I say believe what you read, I don't mean read the newspaper. I mean go deeper, deeper and deeper, and then make your judgments.
In fact, that's the value of this book, because it is so well researched. The wealth of detail that Navtej has got in his book, and he's strung it all together in such a readable manner. And, I think really, Navtej, so this is the importance of the historical novel. What are your thoughts on that?
No, I think the historical novel is a tremendous thing because it makes history popular. That's, for want of a better word. This is a way of telling. Yeah, it's accessible. It's accessible if the historical novel is written with a certain amount of conscience and you're not changing history. What you do is history is like this wall, and we are the fictional characters in front of this wall. This doesn't change. We can do what we want. So that's my view of a historical novel. And I think if you read the great historical novel, you read War and Peace. You don't need to read Russian history after that. It's there. It's there. You don't need to read anything after that. So you know it all. Because he hasn't changed history. What he's done is given you human dilemmas in front of history. Human relationships, there's love, there's hate, there's betrayal, there's everything. But against a certain, so believe that, go deeper, 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 and don't, I know where you're coming from. Don't think that history keeps changing. No. Interpretation keeps changing. History kya change karoge? So many people died in this particular day, in this particular place, killed by so many. That's history. You know? How many times will you change it?
But then, everybody was sharing the history, you have the version. So, how to interpret the version? Because when I listen to stories from my Nani or from my grandfathers, or they reveal the pain. I think like.
They have. That's true history. Because they're telling you, it's valuable history. That's oral history.
But what they've done in Jallianwala Bagh now is glorifying the.
So, that's it. So, no, it's not glorifying. It's beautifying. I wish they had glorified it.
It turns out to be a celebration, but it's not.
It's not a celebration. It's not, for heaven's sake, how can it be a celebration when at least 700-800 people, there's no even figure, are killed in cold blood? How can you celebrate?
No, but you know, Navtej, if you were to compare the memorial at Auschwitz to, you know, what has been done at Jallianwala Bagh today, I mean, how do the two compare? Auschwitz is very somber, stark, you know.
You know, Arati, I spent an afternoon at Auschwitz alone. Alone. Which means, I mean, and that afternoon still haunts me. Because I went in to take photographs. I was posted in Poland. So that day I had a camera and I said, I just want photographs of this place for myself. And I took a lot of photographs. And it happened to be an afternoon when there was nobody there. It was like the place was creeping with ghosts. I mean, I was scared. And I was walking around, I took a lot of shots, but you know, that is it. The somberness speaks. You don't need to do anything. You don't need to do it. You just need to create, leave things. What do they have in Auschwitz? They have rooms like this. A room like this is full of spectacles. Pile of spectacles of Jewish victims. All the chashmas are collected in one room. And you go there, you don't need to be told anything. You don't need commentary. There's a room, I'm talking of 30 years ago, it must have changed now. But no, I saw it on Instagram recently, it's not changed. There's a room of suitcases with people's names painted. Like, you know, old leather suitcases we used to have with names painted. There's a showcase of cloth, just rolls of fabric. What are they? Rolls made of cloth made of human hair. They're dentures, piles of dentures. That's the way to keep a memorial. You see the crematorium where people were just being, you know, you just go there, there's one candle, that's all. One candle. That's enough. You don't need anything else. There's the gallows where they hung Rudolf Hess, who was the director of Auschwitz. Finally, when the Russians liberated Auschwitz, they hung him right there. So there's just the gallows with flowers, grass growing wild. You don't need anything. So, you know, that's what I mean. It's not glorifying. You don't need to do anything. You don't need to do tamasha about everything. You don't need to do an event about everything. You don't need to have an inauguration about everything. No, just leave it. It speaks for itself. It's strong enough to speak for itself. Bullet holes. I mean, you don't have to paint them, you don't have to circle them, you don't have to give them number, nothing. Just leave it.
Any more questions? Yeah, I think we've ended on a very somber.
I think we've tired them out.
No, I think it's just, very somber and, so stark, the whole thing. But yeah, that's a slice of history. And, I mean, I think it's good for all of us to read it, understand it, and feel it, because that's our past. And that's how we will deal with the future.
Yeah, I think that's all. If it serves the purpose of 15 of you sort of re-looking at this, I think the book has done its job. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.